Detective Sarah Chen's coffee had gone cold hours ago, but she couldn't pull herself away from the photograph spread across her desk at the Millbrook Police Department. The Christmas morning image from 1991 showed 5 children arranged beneath a Fraser fir, their faces bright with holiday excitement. What had seemed like a routine missing persons cold case review had become something far more sinister when a digital enhancement specialist noticed something the original investigators had missed 33 years ago. A shadow in the background that shouldn't have been there, and a 6th child's reflection barely visible in the ornament hanging nearest the camera. The photograph had arrived in Chen's inbox 3 days earlier, as part of a systematic digitization project aimed at solving cold cases using modern technology. The Hartwell family disappearance had puzzled investigators for over 3 decades. On December 27, 1991, Margaret Hartwell had called Millbrook Police to report that her 5 children, ranging in age from 4 to 14, had not returned from what was supposed to be a day trip to their grandfather's farm in rural Clearwater County. When officers arrived at the property on Elm Ridge Road, they found no trace of the children or of 78-year-old Edwin Hartwell, Margaret's father-in-law. Chen adjusted her reading glasses and studied the faces again. Emma Hartwell, 14, sat cross-legged on the left side of the frame, her auburn hair catching the morning light streaming through frost-covered windows. Beside her, 12-year-old Michael clutched a new baseball glove, his gap-toothed grin frozen in time. The twins, Sarah and Samuel, both 10, flanked their 4-year-old brother Danny, who held a stuffed elephant that would later become a crucial piece of evidence. The photograph had been taken by Margaret Hartwell using a Kodak disposable camera, one of 27 shots from that Christmas morning that she had developed at the Walgreens on Main Street 2 days before her children vanished. What troubled Chen most wasn't what the photograph showed, but what it revealed about the timeline investigators had constructed in 1991. According to Margaret's original statement, Edwin Hartwell had called on December 26th to invite the children for a post-Christmas visit to see the new calves born on his dairy farm. She claimed this was the first contact they'd had with Edwin in nearly 6 months, following a bitter family dispute over her late husband's will. However, the Christmas photo clearly showed Danny wearing a distinctive red wool sweater with a hand-knitted reindeer pattern, a sweater that Margaret insisted she had never seen before the children disappeared. Chen's partner, Detective Luis Rodriguez, appeared in the doorway of her cubicle carrying a fresh cup of coffee and a manila folder thick with documents. Rodriguez had been working cold cases for 15 years, and his methodical approach to evidence review had earned him a reputation as one of the department's most thorough investigators. His weathered face bore the expression of someone who had seen too many families destroyed by unanswered questions. "The fiber analysis came back from the state lab," Rodriguez said, settling into the chair beside Chen's desk. "That sweater Danny's wearing in the photo? The wool contains traces of lanolin and natural dyes consistent with sheep raised in the Clearwater County area during the late 1980s and early 1990s. More specifically, the dye pattern matches samples from fleece sold at the Clearwater County Fair between 1989 and 1991. Chen felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the sensation that always accompanied a breakthrough in a long-dormant case. So Edwin had contact with the family before December 26th. Margaret lied about the timeline. "Gets better," Rodriguez continued, opening the folder to reveal a stack of yellowed documents. "I spent yesterday at the county recorder's office going through property deeds and tax records. Edwin Hartwell didn't just own the dairy farm on Elm Ridge Road. He also owned a second property 47 acres of undeveloped woodland about 3 miles northeast of the main farm. The deed shows he purchased it in 1987, 4 years before the disappearance. Here's the interesting part. The property taxes stopped being paid in December 1991. Chen studied the property survey map Rodriguez had photocopied. The woodland tract was accessible only by a narrow dirt road that branched off County Route 15, winding through dense stands of pine and oak before terminating at what appeared to be a small clearing. Handwritten notes in the margin indicated the presence of an old foundation, possibly from a 19th-century homestead that had long since fallen into ruin. "Have we been out there?" Chen asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Rodriguez shook his head. Original investigators never knew about the second property. Margaret never mentioned it, and Edwin's records were scattered across 3 different attorneys after he died intestate in 1993. The property got tied up in probate hell for years, then eventually reverted to the county for unpaid taxes. It's been sitting vacant ever since. The afternoon sun slanted through the precinct's windows as Chen and Rodriguez made the 40-minute drive to Clearwater County. The landscape gradually shifted from suburban developments to rolling farmland dotted with weathered barns and silos. Chen had grown up in this region, and the familiar sight of Holstein cattle grazing in snow-dusted pastures triggered memories of her own childhood visits to her grandmother's farm. She tried to push aside the personal connections and focus on the investigation, but something about this case had gotten under her skin in a way that surprised her. They found County Route 15 easily enough, a 2-lane blacktop that curved through stands of bare maples and evergreens. The dirt road Rodriguez had identified on the property map proved more elusive. They passed it twice before Chen spotted the overgrown entrance, barely visible behind a screen of wild raspberry canes and volunteer saplings. Rodriguez's Ford Explorer lurched and bounced as they navigated the rutted track, bare branches scraping against the windows with sounds like fingernails on glass. The road ended abruptly at a circular clearing perhaps 50 yards across. At the center stood the remnants of a stone foundation, its walls rising no more than 3 feet above ground level. Wild grapevines had claimed most of the structure, their bare winter tendrils creating a web of shadows across the old stonework. Chen and Rodriguez approached cautiously, their boots crunching through a layer of fallen leaves that released the musty scent of decay and rich earth. "There," Rodriguez said, pointing to a depression in the ground near the eastern corner of the foundation. "Ground-penetrating radar would tell us more, but that looks like disturbed soil to me." Chen knelt beside the depression, brushing away layers of dead leaves and forest debris. The earth here felt different, softer, and less compacted than the surrounding area. She found herself thinking about the children in the Christmas photograph, imagining their voices echoing through these silent woods. The thought made her stomach clench with a mixture of dread and determination. They spent another hour systematically walking the property, documenting potential evidence sites with Rodriguez's digital camera and GPS unit. Near the foundation's northwest corner, Chen discovered fragments of what appeared to be blue fabric, caught on a low-hanging branch. The material had faded and deteriorated after decades of exposure, but enough remained to suggest it had once been part of a child's clothing. She carefully collected the fragments using sterile tweezers and evidence bags, following chain of custody protocols that had become second nature after 18 years in law enforcement. As they prepared to leave, Rodriguez noticed tire tracks pressed into a muddy section near the clearing's edge. The tracks were old but still visible, protected from erosion by their position beneath an overhanging pine. Chen photographed the impressions from multiple angles, noting their depth and width. The pattern suggested a heavy vehicle, possibly a pickup truck or large van, had been driven into the clearing and parked for an extended period. The drive back to Millbrook passed in contemplative silence. Chen found herself replaying the timeline of events from December 1991, searching for inconsistencies and gaps that the original investigators might have missed. Margaret Hartwell's behavior had always seemed strange to the detectives who first worked the case. She had been oddly composed during interviews, showing little of the hysteria or desperation typically displayed by parents of missing children. Her answers to questions about the family's relationship with Edwin had been vague and sometimes contradictory. Back at the precinct, Chen pulled Margaret Hartwell's original case file and spread the interview transcripts across her desk. Reading through the yellowed pages, she was struck by how often Margaret had deflected questions about her children's relationship with their grandfather. When asked if the children enjoyed visiting Edwin's farm, Margaret had replied that they went when they had to. When pressed for clarification, she had become defensive, stating that Edwin was set in his ways and sometimes difficult with children. Detective Jennifer Walsh, who had conducted the original interviews, had noted Margaret's evasiveness, but had attributed it to grief and shock. Walsh, now retired and living in Arizona, had graciously agreed to a phone interview when Chen called her that evening. Her voice carried the weight of decades spent investigating crimes against children, and Chen could hear the lingering frustration of an unsolved case that had haunted her career. "Margaret Hartwell was hiding something," Walsh said without preamble. "I knew it from the first interview, but I could never pin down what it was. She had this way of answering questions without really answering them, if you know what I mean. Every time I tried to get specifics about the family dynamics, she'd start crying or change the subject." Chen took notes as Walsh described her memories of the investigation. The original search efforts had been extensive by 1991 standards, involving state police, volunteer firefighters, and tracking dogs from the county sheriff's department. The dogs had picked up scent trails leading from Edwin's farmhouse toward the woods, but had lost the trail at a creek that ran along the southern boundary of the property. At the time, investigators had assumed the children might have wandered off and become lost in the extensive woodland that covered much of Clearwater County. "We focused on accidental death or misadventure," Walsh explained. 5 kids don't just vanish without a trace unless something catastrophic happened. We dragged every pond and creek within a 10-mile radius. We had volunteers combing the woods for weeks. But we never found so much as a scrap of clothing or a single shoe. Chen described the Christmas photograph and the evidence they had discovered at the woodland property. Walsh listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification about specific details. When Chen finished, there was a long silence on the line. "That changes everything," Walsh said finally. "If Edwin had contact with the family before December 26th, then Margaret's entire story falls apart. And if he owned property where the children might have been taken, Jesus, Sarah, we were looking in all the wrong places." The next morning brought unseasonably warm weather that melted the previous week's snow and turned the unpaved roads of Clearwater County into muddy quagmires. Chen and Rodriguez returned to the woodland property, accompanied by a forensic team from the state police and a ground-penetrating radar specialist from the University of Pennsylvania's archaeology department. Dr. Michael Foster had volunteered his services after reading about the case in the Philadelphia Inquirer's Cold Case feature series. Foster's equipment revealed what their eyes had suggested the day before: multiple areas of disturbed soil concentrated around the old foundation. The radar readings showed anomalies consistent with deliberately excavated and refilled graves. The largest anomaly measured approximately 6 feet by 4 feet and appeared to contain what Foster described as organized materials, objects that showed up as distinct geometric shapes rather than the random patterns typical of natural soil deposits. Chen watched the radar operator's screen with growing apprehension as the systematic survey revealed a pattern that made her blood run cold. 5 distinct burial sites arranged in a rough semicircle around the foundation's western wall. The locations corresponded almost exactly to the ages of the Hartwell children: smaller graves toward the center, larger ones at the edges. The excavation began that afternoon under Dr. Foster's careful supervision. Each burial site was treated as a potential crime scene, with photographers documenting every stage of the process and forensic specialists collecting soil samples for chemical analysis. Chen found herself unable to watch as the first grave was carefully exposed, its contents slowly revealed through painstaking brushwork and gentle excavation. The remains were clearly those of a child, and scraps of clothing suggested they had been buried fully dressed. A small leather shoe, size 6, emerged from the soil along with fragments of what appeared to be a wool coat. Chen's chest tightened as she recognized the distinctive red color, the same shade as the sweater Danny Hartwell had worn in the Christmas photograph. As the excavation continued over the following days, each grave yielded similar, heartbreaking evidence. Personal items that matched descriptions from the original missing persons reports. Michael's baseball glove, now stained and deteriorated but still recognizable. A pair of wire-rimmed glasses that had belonged to Emma. A small backpack containing what remained of coloring books and crayons. The forensic odontologist confirmed what Chen already knew in her heart. These were the 5 Hartwell children, finally found after 33 years. The discovery that shattered Chen's composure came on the 3rd day of excavation. Buried with 4-year-old Danny, archaeologists found the stuffed elephant from the Christmas photograph. The toy had been carefully wrapped in what appeared to be a child's blanket, suggesting someone had tried to provide comfort even in death. Chen excused herself from the excavation site and walked into the woods, where she allowed herself 5 minutes of the tears she had been holding back since the investigation began. Dr. Foster's preliminary examination of the remains revealed no obvious signs of trauma, but full forensic analysis would require weeks of careful laboratory work. What was immediately clear was that the children had been buried with care laid out straight, arms at their sides, personal possessions arranged around them. This wasn't the work of a killer disposing of evidence. It was someone trying to provide a measure of dignity in death. The search for Edwin Hartwell's remains proved more challenging. Ground-penetrating radar detected what appeared to be a 7th burial site, approximately 50 yards from the foundation, but initial excavation revealed only animal bones and decayed fabric that might have been work clothes. It wasn't until Chen suggested expanding the search to include the foundation itself that they found what they were looking for. Hidden beneath a carefully constructed stone cairn in the foundation's southwest corner lay the remains of an elderly man. The location had been chosen with deliberate symbolism. Edwin Hartwell had been buried within the walls of what had once been a family home, perhaps built by his own ancestors. Beside the body, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected it from decades of moisture, investigators found a leather-bound journal filled with Edwin's distinctive handwriting. Chen read the journal's final entries by lamplight in her hotel room that evening, struggling to comprehend the story that emerged from Edwin's careful script. The old man had documented a secret that had festered within the Hartwell family for generations, a pattern of abuse that stretched back to his own father and had continued through his son, Margaret's deceased husband. Edwin's words revealed a man tortured by knowledge he had gained too late. He had discovered evidence that his son David had been sexually abusing the children and confronted Margaret about her failure to protect them. The conversation had escalated into a physical altercation during which David had suffered a heart attack. Edwin had spent the last months of his life caring for his traumatized grandchildren while wrestling with impossible choices. The journal's final entry, dated December 27, 1991, contained Edwin's confession and explanation. Faced with the children's continued trauma and his own failing health, he had made a decision that haunted Chen long after she finished reading. Unable to bear the thought of returning the children to an environment where they couldn't be protected, and knowing that his own death would leave them vulnerable to continued abuse, Edwin had given them what he saw as the only peace he could provide. "I pray that God will forgive me," the final entry concluded. "They are at rest now, and no one can hurt them anymore. I go to join them, and perhaps in death we can be the family we never were in life." Toxicology results confirmed what the journal suggested. Edwin had administered a lethal dose of veterinary barbiturates to each child before taking his own life. The drug was commonly used on farms to euthanize suffering animals, and Edwin's agricultural background would have given him access to sufficient quantities. The children would have simply fallen asleep and never awakened. Chen struggled with the emotional complexity of Edwin's actions as she prepared her final report. While she couldn't condone what he had done, she found herself understanding the impossible position in which he had found himself. The justice system of 1991 had been poorly equipped to handle cases of child sexual abuse, particularly when they involved prominent local families. Edwin had likely concluded that his grandchildren faced a lifetime of continued trauma, with little hope of protection or healing. Margaret Hartwell's reaction to the discovery proved Chen's instincts about the timeline had been correct. When confronted with evidence from the journal and the Christmas photograph, Margaret finally revealed the truth about the days leading up to December 27th. Edwin had contacted her in early December, demanding that she bring the children to his farm so he could document evidence of their abuse. He had threatened to expose the family's secrets if she refused. The red sweater Danny wore in the Christmas photograph had been a gift from Edwin, part of his desperate attempt to create normal, loving memories for children who had known too little kindness. Margaret had allowed the children to spend Christmas Eve at Edwin's farm, where he had taken dozens of photographs and recorded video testimony that he planned to present to authorities. When Margaret arrived on December 27th to collect her children, she found Edwin's note explaining what he had done and warning her never to reveal the truth. "He said they were finally safe," Margaret told Chen during their final interview, her voice hollow with decades of guilt and suppressed grief. "He said no one could hurt them anymore, and that if I ever told anyone what really happened, he would find a way to make sure I joined them." Margaret had spent 33 years living with the knowledge of where her children were buried, carrying the secret that had slowly consumed her life. She had never remarried, never moved from the house where the abuse had occurred, never allowed herself the possibility of healing or happiness. Edwin's final act of protection had become her lifetime sentence. The case officially closed 6 months later when the district attorney declined to pursue charges against Margaret for her failure to report the deaths or mislead investigators. The statute of limitations had long since expired, and prosecutors concluded that Margaret had herself been a victim of both her deceased husband's abuse and Edwin's desperate actions. Chen attended the children's funeral service at St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Millbrook, where 5 small caskets were finally laid to rest in the cemetery's children's section. Margaret sat alone in the front pew, her body rigid with grief that seemed to have crystallized into permanent armor. Chen wanted to offer some words of comfort, but she knew there were no words adequate to address 33 years of anguish and guilt. The Christmas photograph remained in Chen's case file, a reminder of the complex moral landscape that often characterized her work. The image that had initially appeared to show 5 happy children on Christmas morning had become evidence of a grandfather's desperate love and a family's tragic disintegration. Chen often found herself wondering what might have happened if Edwin had chosen differently, if he had trusted the system to protect his grandchildren, if he had found another way to break the cycle of abuse that had defined his family's history. Dr. Foster's archaeological report noted that Edwin had buried each child with objects that represented their individual personalities and interests. Emma had been laid to rest with her diary and a collection of books. Michael's grave contained his baseball cards and a model airplane he had been building. The twins were buried with art supplies and the collection of rocks they had gathered during nature walks. Danny had a stuffed elephant and a wooden truck Edwin had carved for him during their final weeks together. These details suggested that Edwin had spent considerable time with each child before their deaths, learning about their hopes and fears, trying to provide them with love and attention they had been denied. Chen found this knowledge both comforting and heartbreaking. The children's final weeks had been filled with the grandfather's desperate attempt to give them experiences of safety and care. The woodland property was eventually purchased by a local conservation group that converted it into a nature preserve dedicated to the memory of the 5 children. A small memorial garden was planted near the old foundation, with benches where visitors could sit quietly among the native wildflowers and remember young lives cut short by circumstances beyond their control. Chen retired from the Millbrook Police Department 3 years after solving the Hartwell case, but she continued to think about the family's story. She had seen enough human cruelty in her career to recognize that evil often wore familiar faces and hid within trusted institutions. The Hartwell case had reinforced her belief that some of the most profound moral questions emerged from situations where there were no clear answers, only competing forms of pain and desperate attempts to provide protection. Margaret Hartwell died quietly in her sleep 4 years after the children's remains were discovered. Neighbors found her in the garden behind the house where her family had once lived, tending the roses she had planted for each child's birthday. She had left detailed instructions for her burial alongside her children, along with a trust fund to maintain the memorial garden in perpetuity. Chen's final report on the Hartwell case became required reading for new detectives in the cold case unit, not because of its investigative techniques, but because of its exploration of the complicated motivations that could drive ordinary people to extraordinary actions. The case had demonstrated that truth was often more complex than justice, and that solving a mystery didn't always provide the closure that families sought. The Christmas photograph was eventually returned to the memorial garden, where it was displayed in a weatherproof case near the garden's entrance. Visitors could see the 5 children as they had been on their final Christmas morning, young, hopeful, surrounded by evidence of love and care that had come too late to save them but had provided comfort in their final days. Chen often visited the memorial garden during the anniversary week of the discovery, sitting quietly on one of the wooden benches and reflecting on the complex legacy of Edwin Hartwell's choices. She had come to understand that some crimes were committed not from hatred or greed, but from love that had nowhere left to go. The tragedy of the Hartwell family lay not just in the deaths of 5 children, but in a grandfather's conclusion that death was the only protection he could provide. The case files eventually found their way into the archives of the National Center for Missing Children, where they served as a resource for investigators working similar cases. Chen had included detailed notes about the importance of examining family dynamics beyond the obvious relationships, and the need to investigate all properties associated with potential suspects. Her work had contributed to protocols that helped other investigators avoid the tunnel vision that had initially limited the scope of the search for the Hartwell children. Years later, when Chen was asked to speak at law enforcement conferences about cold case investigations, she always returned to the lesson she had learned from the Christmas photograph. Evidence could hide in plain sight for decades, waiting for technology or perspective to reveal its secrets. More importantly, the human stories behind cold cases were often more complex than the simple narratives of good and evil that investigators preferred to construct. The Hartwell case had taught her that justice and closure were not always synonymous, and that solving a mystery could sometimes create as many questions as it answered. Edwin Hartwell had committed an unforgivable act, driven by what he saw as unbearable love. Margaret Hartwell had spent a lifetime paying for her failure to protect her children, and her inability to stop their grandfather's final solution. The children themselves had become casualties not just of abuse but of the adults' tragic inability to find better alternatives. Chen's investigation had provided answers about what had happened to the 5 Hartwell children, but it had also revealed the dangerous fragility of families struggling with secrets they felt they couldn't share. The Christmas photograph that had broken the case open remained a powerful reminder that even the most ordinary moments could contain shadows of pain and desperation, invisible to casual observation. In the end, the true tragedy of the Hartwell family was not just the loss of 5 young lives, but the destruction of everyone who had loved them. Edwin Hartwell's journal had revealed a man who had spent his final months trying to repair damage that decades of silence and denial had made irreparable. His choice to end his grandchildren's lives rather than risk their continued suffering reflected a moral calculation that Chen found both horrifying and heartbreakingly understandable. The Christmas photograph now served as a memorial not just to the 5 children, but to the complexity of love and protection in families where traditional forms of safety had failed. Chen often reflected that the case had taught her as much about the limits of law enforcement as it had about investigative techniques. Some tragedies occurred because the systems designed to protect children were inadequate to address the sophisticated forms of manipulation and control that characterized long-term family abuse. The Memorial Garden continued to attract visitors from across the region, many of whom came not just to remember the Hartwell children, but to reflect on their own family relationships and the signs of distress they might have overlooked in their own communities. The garden had become a place where difficult conversations about child protection and family violence could begin, serving a purpose that Edwin Hartwell could never have imagined when he made his final, desperate decision in the woods of Clearwater County.